I remember the exact weight of my wedding ring as I slid it off that night. 14 years of wearing it had carved a pale groove around my finger, and now, sitting alone in my car in the parking lot of the Marriott, I watched the dashboard lights catch the gold band as I placed it carefully in the cup holder beside my keys. The work function had ended an hour ago, but I hadn't moved. The engine was off, the autumn air seeping through the gaps in the windows, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and distant rain. Other cars had long since pulled away, their headlights sweeping across my windshield like searchlights before disappearing into the night. I was alone now with the hum of the highway in the distance and the soft glow of my phone screen. The message had been waiting when I checked my phone after the presentations ended, after the handshakes and small talk about quarterly reports and weekend plans. For words that made my chest tighten. Same excuse as last time. The sender's name glowed beneath it, Julian Cortez. A name that had once been as familiar to me as my own, then absent for years, and now back again, threading through my life like a song I thought I'd forgotten. Clara would be at home, probably reading in bed, expecting me to slip in quietly with some story about networking running late or helping a colleague with a problem. She had stopped asking for details months ago, accepting my explanations with the same distant nod she gave when I told her I'd taken out the garbage or paid the electric bill. These lies had become as routine as brushing my teeth, as automatic as checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. But tonight felt different. Tonight, staring at Julian's message, I could taste the metallic edge of the lie before I even formed it. I could see myself walking through our front door, hanging my coat in the closet, moving through the motions of a man returning home from legitimate business. The practiced ease of it frightened me more than the deception itself. I typed and deleted 3 different responses. Each one felt too revealing, too honest, too much like the truth I had been carrying around like a stone in my chest. Finally, I wrote, running late. Home soon. But I didn't send it. My thumb hovered over the screen as cars passed on the street beyond the parking lot, their taillights blurring into red streaks. Julian had taught me this language of careful omissions, these half-truths that weren't quite lies. When we reconnected 6 months ago at Mike's retirement party, it had started as a joke between 2 married men who understood the weight of expectations. Cover stories for innocent escapes, late dinners that ran too long, work meetings that never quite ended, errands that stretched into the evening hours. What harm could there be in giving each other alibis for stolen time? But as I sat there in the dark, my wedding ring catching the light like an accusation, I knew we had stopped covering for innocent things. The excuses had become a shelter, and somewhere along the way, I had begun to need that shelter more than I needed to go home. I picked up the ring and held it up to the light. 18 years ago, Clara had slipped it onto my finger in a church filled with everyone we loved, promising to honor and cherish until death do us part. I had meant those words then, believed in them with the certainty of a man who thought he knew himself completely. Now, the ring felt foreign in my palm, a relic from a life I was no longer sure how to inhabit. The parking lot was empty except for a security light that flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across the asphalt. In that unstable light, I caught my reflection in the side mirror, a man of 42 with graying temples and tired eyes, sitting alone in his car, holding his marriage in his hands like something fragile and breakable. I knew I should start the engine, drive home, slip back into the life that was waiting for me. Instead, I set the ring back in the cup holder and stared at Julian's message until the screen went dark. That night, I eventually did drive home, slipping my wedding ring back into place before I turned the key in the front door. The house welcomed me with its familiar silence, the dishwasher humming in the kitchen, the soft glow of Clara's reading lights spilling down the upstairs hallway, the everyday proof of a life built on predictable rhythms. Our home sat on Maple Street in Westfield Heights, a neighborhood where the lawns were measured by invisible standards and the mailboxes stood at regulation heights. It was the kind of place where children rode bikes in careful circles and neighbors waved from identical front porches. We had chosen it deliberately, Clara and I, for the school district and the tree-lined streets, for the promise of stability it offered our children. Emma was 12 then, already growing tall and serious, spending her evenings bent over homework at the kitchen table. David, 9, still believed in the magic of Saturday morning cartoons and asked endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dogs dreamed. They were good children, the kind teachers described as well-adjusted and polite, and I loved them with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes surprised me with its intensity. At Morton & Associates Insurance, I was known as the steady one. 15 years with the company had earned me a corner office with 2 windows and a reputation for reliability. My colleagues trusted me with their vacation schedules, their client concerns, their casual confidences about mortgage rates and school fundraisers. I arrived each morning at 8:15, stayed until the work was finished, and rarely declined when someone needed coverage for a meeting or a family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional life was built on managing risk, on calculating probabilities, and preparing for the unexpected, while my personal life had become an exercise in maintaining surfaces. Clara and I moved through our days like practice dance partners, each knowing our steps, rarely stumbling, but somehow never quite touching. She worked part-time at the library downtown, organizing book clubs and story hours for children whose mothers looked exactly like her. Carefully dressed, quietly accomplished, committed to creating the right kind of childhood for their families. Clara was beautiful in the way that aged gracefully. With auburn hair, she kept shoulder length and a smile she reserved for parent-teacher conferences and church functions. But in the evenings, when the children finished their homework and settled into bed, Clara and I would find ourselves sharing the same space without quite sharing the same world. She read historical fiction and mysteries. I watched the news or caught up on work emails. We discussed schedules and grocery lists, summer camp options, and home repairs. When she turned off her reading light and rolled toward her side of the bed, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the careful distance between us like a third presence in the room. It was into this carefully measured life that Julian reappeared, though reappeared isn't quite accurate. We had exchanged Christmas cards over the years, brief updates about marriages and children, the kind of distant connection that college friendships often become. I knew he had moved back to town 5 years earlier, that he taught high school drama, and had married a woman named Vanessa who worked in marketing. But knowledge and presence are different things entirely. At Mike Patterson's retirement party last spring, I spotted Julian across the hotel banquet room before he saw me. 20 years had added lines around his eyes and gray to his dark hair, but he still carried himself with that particular confidence I remembered from college, the way he could command a room's attention without seeming to try. He had been an English major with a minor in theater, the kind of student who read poetry aloud in coffee shops and could quote entire scenes from plays I'd never heard of. We had been inseparable once, Julian and I, roommates for 3 years, study partners, co-conspirators in the small rebellions of college life. We stayed up too late talking about books and dreams, spent weekends exploring the city beyond campus, shared the easy intimacy of young men who believed they understood everything about themselves and the world. After graduation, I had taken the first job offer that came along and married Clara within 2 years. Julian had disappeared to Chicago to work in small theaters, chasing something I never quite understood. When he approached me at Mike's party, his smile was exactly as I remembered it, warm and slightly conspiratorial, as if we shared a secret joke. We fell into conversation as if 2 decades hadn't passed, swapping stories about our children, our mortgages, the peculiar exhaustion of middle age. His wife Vanessa joined us briefly, a sharp-eyed woman with an easy laugh who seemed to watch Julian with a mixture of affection and careful attention. Later, as the evening wound down, Julian suggested we grab coffee sometime. "Just 2 old friends catching up," he said. "Nothing complicated about it." I agreed without hesitation, already looking forward to conversations that might venture beyond car repairs and parent-teacher conferences. That first coffee meeting stretched into 3 hours. We chose a place downtown, far enough from both our neighborhoods to feel safely anonymous, and talked about everything except the careful lives we had built. Julian told me about directing high school productions of Shakespeare and watching 17-year-olds discover the power of language. I found myself describing the satisfaction of solving insurance puzzles, of finding coverage solutions that actually helped people when disasters struck. But gradually, our conversations began to include the unspoken spaces in our lives. Julian mentioned that Vanessa worked late most evenings, leaving him alone with their 8-year-old daughter Sophie. I talked about Clara's book club meetings and her weekend library commitments. Neither of us said we were lonely, but the subtext hung between us like smoke. It was Julian who first suggested we might cover for each other occasionally. A harmless arrangement between two married men who sometimes needed alibis for innocent escapes. If Vanessa asked where he'd been, he could mention having coffee with his college roommate who worked in insurance. If Clara wondered about my evening meetings, I could reference catching up with an old friend who taught at the high school. What could be more natural than two men maintaining a friendship from their college days? The arrangement began simply enough. Julian would text me when he planned to stay late at school to work on a production, and I would be prepared to corroborate his story if needed. I would mention when I had legitimate evening meetings, and he would remember the details in case Clara ever called to verify. We were providing each other with the gift of plausible explanations, nothing more complicated than that. Except somewhere in those early conversations, I began to notice things I hadn't allowed myself to see 20 years earlier. The way Julian's attention focused completely on whoever was speaking. The way he laughed, not politely, but with his entire body. The way his hand moved when he talked, elegant and expressive, drawing shapes in the air that somehow made his words more real. And I began to notice my own anticipation when my phone buzzed with his messages, the way I found myself thinking about things I wanted to tell him, the peculiar lightness I felt driving to our coffee meetings. These observations floated at the edges of my consciousness like objects glimpsed in peripheral vision, present but not quite acknowledged, real but not quite named. The call came on a Thursday evening in late September, just as I was helping Emma with her algebra homework at the kitchen table. Clara was upstairs running a bath for David, and the house held that particular quiet of early autumn evenings when the light began to fade earlier and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Julian's voice sounded different over the phone, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. He asked if he could come over, said he needed to talk to someone, and would it be possible for him to stay the night? He could tell Vanessa he was crashing at my place after a long conversation about work, he explained. She was suspicious lately about his evening meetings at school, questioning whether the drama department really required so many late rehearsals. I found myself saying yes before I fully considered what I was agreeing to. Clara looked up from the dish towel she was folding when I explained that Julian needed a place to stay, that he was having some difficulties at home. She nodded with the practical kindness that characterized most of her responses, said she would put fresh sheets on the guest room bed, and make sure there were clean towels in the hall bathroom. Julian arrived after 9, carrying a small overnight bag and a bottle of wine that looked more expensive than anything Clara and I usually kept in the house. The children had been asleep for an hour, and Clara was already in our bedroom with her book and her reading glasses, settled into her evening routine. I met Julian at the front door, and when he stepped inside, he seemed to bring with him an energy that made our carefully organized home feel suddenly smaller. We sat at first in the living room, drinking the wine he had brought and talking in low voices about safe subjects. His rehearsals for the fall production of Our Town, my recent success in securing coverage for a client's flooding claim. But there was something electric in the air between us, a tension I couldn't quite name. Julian kept glancing toward the staircase as if he could sense Clara's presence above us, and I found myself hyper-aware of every sound in the house, every creak of settling wood. After an hour, I suggested we move outside to the back porch, where we could talk more freely without worrying about waking anyone. The October air was crisp but not yet cold, and I brought out a small battery-powered lantern that cast a warm circle of light around the 2 wicker chairs Clara had arranged there for summer evenings. The wine and the darkness loosened something in both of us. Julian told me about his growing arguments with Vanessa, how she accused him of being distant, of living like a stranger in his own house. He said she wasn't wrong, that sometimes he felt like he was performing the role of husband and father rather than actually inhabiting it. I found myself admitting things I had never said aloud, that Clara and I had been moving through our marriage like polite roommates for years, that I sometimes felt suffocated by the careful predictability of our life together. As the evening wore on, our conversation meandered through territory I hadn't explored with anyone. Julian talked about the students in his drama classes, how they seemed to possess an emotional honesty that he envied. He described watching them discover characters on stage, seeing them access parts of themselves they didn't know existed. I found myself telling him about moments at work when I helped clients navigate genuine crises, house fires, accidents, losses that stripped away all pretense, and how those interactions felt more real than most of the conversations in my personal life. The lantern flickered occasionally, casting shifting shadows across Julian's face, and I noticed details I hadn't allowed myself to observe during our coffee meetings. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was thinking. The way his smile changed depending on whether he was being polite or genuinely amused. The way he looked directly at me when I spoke, as if my words mattered more than they actually did. Sometime after midnight, as we were finishing the wine, Julian leaned back in his chair and stared up at the sky, where a few stars were visible despite the suburban light pollution. The silence stretched between us, comfortable but charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then he said something that changed everything. He said, "Funny, isn't it? We keep pretending we're covering for each other, when really, I think we're both hiding from the same thing." His words hung in the autumn air like a question I wasn't prepared to answer. I felt my chest tighten, felt something shift in the careful balance I had maintained for months. I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to pretend I didn't understand, wanted to change the subject to something safer. Instead, I sat in silence, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the oak tree that overhung our neighbor's fence. Julian didn't push for a response. He simply sat there, holding his empty wine glass, letting his observation settle between us like a stone dropped into still water. When he finally spoke again, it was to say he should probably get some sleep, that he had an early meeting with the principal about budget allocations for the spring musical. I showed him to the guest room, pointed out the extra blankets in the closet and the bathroom down the hall. When I said goodnight, he looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt something pass between us that I couldn't quite name. A recognition, perhaps, or a question, or a door opening onto possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. Back in my own bedroom, Clara was already asleep, her breathing deep and regular. I lay beside her in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Julian's words. We're both hiding from the same thing. What thing? What was I hiding from exactly? The question followed me towards sleep like a shadow I couldn't shake. In the morning, Julian was gone before I woke up, but he had left a note on the kitchen counter thanking Clara and me for the hospitality. The guest room bed was perfectly made, the towels folded and replaced in the linen closet. It was as if he had never been there at all, except for the way my mind kept returning to our conversation on the porch, to the weight of his words, to the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the careful architecture of my life. For days afterward, I found myself replaying every detail of that evening. The way Julian had looked at me across the small circle of lantern light. The way his voice had softened when he talked about feeling like a stranger in his own house. The way my pulse had quickened when he suggested we were hiding from the same thing, as if he had reached across the darkness and touched something I had kept carefully buried. I began to notice things I had trained myself not to see. How my heart rate increased when his name appeared on my phone. How I found excuses to drive past the high school where he worked. How our coffee meetings had become the brightest points in weeks that otherwise felt gray and routine. These observations accumulated like evidence of something I wasn't ready to name, something that made me feel both more alive and more terrified than I had felt in years. After that night on the porch, something changed in the rhythm of our meetings. What had been weekly coffee dates became twice-weekly dinners at restaurants across town, far from the familiar territory where we might encounter neighbors or colleagues. Julian would text me in the afternoons with suggestions, a new Italian place near the university, a quiet bar that served decent food, anywhere we could sit for hours without drawing attention. Our cover stories grew more elaborate and somehow more truthful. I told Clara I was having regular dinners with Julian to help him work through his marital problems, which wasn't entirely a lie. She nodded with understanding, even approval, saying it was good of me to be supportive during his difficult time. Julian told Vanessa he was meeting with me to discuss insurance options for the drama department, a plausible explanation that gave us entire evenings together without suspicion. But these alibis had become something different than the casual favors we had once exchanged. They were doorways now, portals into a private world where we could exist as versions of ourselves that our carefully constructed lives didn't allow. In restaurants with dim lighting and tables tucked into corners, we talked about things that had no place in our suburban existences. Julian told me about the year after college when he had lived in Chicago, working as a barista while auditioning for small theater companies. He described the cramped studio apartment he shared with two other aspiring actors, the late-night rehearsals in church basements, the intoxicating possibility that he might actually make a life out of words and performance. He had been different then, he said, more willing to take risks, more willing to follow impulses that led to uncertain destinations. I found myself talking about dreams I had buried so completely I had forgotten they existed. Before insurance and mortgages and parent-teacher conferences, I had imagined myself as a travel writer, documenting places and cultures that most people never saw. I had saved money during college for a backpacking trip through Europe that I never took, choosing instead the security of an immediate job offer and a girlfriend who became a fiancée, who became a wife. These conversations felt like archaeology, like excavating buried artifacts from lives we had never quite lived. And gradually, without either of us acknowledging it directly, our meetings began to extend beyond dinner. We would drive afterward, sometimes for hours, taking country roads that led nowhere in particular, stopping at overlooks or parking near the Susquehanna River where we could sit in the darkness and continue talking. One evening in early November, as we sat in Julian's car watching the river reflect the lights of the bridge downstream, he told me something that shifted the ground beneath everything we had been building together. He said that during his second year in Chicago, he had begun a relationship with another actor named Marcus. It had lasted 6 months, he said, 6 months of secrecy and intensity and a kind of happiness he had never experienced before or since. He had ended it out of fear, he told me, fear of what it meant, fear of how it would change everything he thought he knew about himself. He had come back home, thrown himself into safe choices, married Vanessa within a year because she represented the life he was supposed to want. But sometimes, he said, staring out at the dark water, he wondered what would have happened if he had been braver. I listened to this confession in silence, my hands folded in my lap, feeling something enormous and unnamed expanding in my chest. Julian had dared something I had never even allowed myself to imagine, and the courage of it terrified and inspired me in equal measure. When he finished talking, he turned to look at me, and in the dim light from the dashboard, I saw a vulnerability that made him seem both younger and older than his 40 years. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that his story resonated with something I had kept locked away so tightly I had convinced myself it didn't exist. Instead, I reached across the space between us and touched his hand where it rested on the steering wheel. It was the first time I had deliberately touched him, and the contact felt electric, dangerous, like crossing a line I could never uncross. After that night, I began to notice things that had been invisible to me before, or perhaps I simply began to allow myself to notice them. The way Julian's eyes lingered on my face when he thought I wasn't looking. The way our conversations seemed to create a bubble of intimacy that made crowded restaurants feel private. The way my pulse quickened when his hand brushed against mine as we reached for the check or passed the salt. I started dreaming about him, dreams that left me lying awake beside Clara with a guilty restlessness I couldn't name. In these dreams, we were always somewhere else, walking along unfamiliar streets, sitting in a car driving toward some destination I never quite reached, talking about things that dissolved the moment I tried to remember them upon waking. But the feeling of the dreams lingered, a sense of possibility and yearning that made my actual life feel like a costume I couldn't remove. The distance between Clara and me, which had been comfortable for so long, began to feel unbearable. At dinner, when she talked about her day at the library or the children's school activities, I found myself nodding and responding while my mind wandered to conversations with Julian, to the way he laughed when something genuinely amused him, to the questions he asked that made me think about my answers for days afterward. Clara noticed my distraction, though she attributed it to work stress or the natural challenges of middle age. She suggested I might benefit from more exercise, from taking up a hobby, from spending more time with friends. The irony of her advice wasn't lost on me. She was encouraging the very thing that was pulling me away from her, though she couldn't have known it. Our cover stories multiplied and became more sophisticated. Julian and I developed an entire fictional consultation project about insurance needs for school districts, complete with meeting schedules and budget discussions that we could reference when our spouses asked for details. The elaborate nature of these deceptions should have troubled me, but instead I found myself impressed by our creativity, by the seamless way we had learned to protect the time we spent together. During one of our river drives in late November, Julian asked me something that I knew I had been avoiding for weeks. He asked if I had ever wondered what it would be like to live a completely different life, to wake up in a different house, next to a different person, with different possibilities stretching out ahead of me. The question hung in the car like a challenge, like a dare, like an invitation to step into territory I had spent 42 years avoiding. I told him yes, that I had been wondering about that more and more lately, though I couldn't quite bring myself to specify what different life I might want. But something in the way I answered, some quality in my voice, made Julian turn to look at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "We're not just talking about career changes, are we?" he said softly. I couldn't answer him directly, couldn't make the leap from implication to admission. But I didn't deny it either, and in that silence, something passed between us that felt like a door opening, like a boundary dissolving, like the moment before a storm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The transformation was happening whether I acknowledged it or not. I was becoming someone different, someone who looked forward to deception because it led to truth, someone who felt more authentic in stolen moments than in the life I had spent decades building. The man who had slid his wedding ring off his finger that night in the parking lot was emerging more clearly with each passing day, and I was both terrified and exhilarated by what he might be capable of. The revelation came on a December evening when the first real snowfall of winter had been forecast, but arrived instead as a cold, driving rain that turned the streets slick and made driving treacherous. Julian had texted me that afternoon asking if I could meet him after work, said he needed to talk to someone, that Vanessa had confronted him about his late nights and his distance, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain the careful balance of his double life. I found him waiting in his car in the parking lot of a closed restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place we had discovered weeks earlier but never actually visited. The rain drummed against his windshield with an intensity that made the world beyond the glass seem to dissolve, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the front seat of his Honda Accord. When I climbed into the passenger seat, my coat soaked from the brief run across the parking lot, Julian looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, raw, desperate, like a man who had reached the end of something and didn't know what came next. He had been crying, I realized, though he tried to hide it, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that broke something open in my chest. We sat in silence at first, listening to the rain and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. The car windows began to fog from our breathing, sealing us further into our private world. Julian stared straight ahead at the blurred lights of the street beyond, his hands gripping the steering wheel though the engine wasn't running. Finally, he began to talk. He told me that Vanessa had accused him of having an affair, that she had demanded to know who he was seeing, where he was going, why he came home smelling like someone else's cologne. She wasn't wrong to be suspicious, he said, but she was wrong about the details. The affair she suspected wasn't the affair he was actually having. if what we were doing could even be called an affair. He talked about lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Vanessa slept beside him, feeling like a fraud in his own bed. He described the growing distance between them, how every conversation felt like a performance, how even simple interactions with their daughter Sophie had become strained because he was always somewhere else in his mind, always thinking about our next meeting, our next conversation, our next stolen evening together. I found myself telling him things I had never admitted to anyone, not even to myself, in the private moments when thoughts emerged that I immediately pushed away. I told him that I had been dreaming about him nearly every night, dreams that left me feeling guilty and confused and more awake than I had felt in years. I told him that our dinners had become the only part of my week that felt real, that everything else, my job, my marriage, even my interactions with my children, had begun to feel like elaborate theater. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof of the car with a force that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. Julian turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the street lamps filtered through water-streaked glass, I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. It was recognition, I realized, the look of someone who had found something they had been searching for without knowing they were searching. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence stretched between us, heavy with things we had been refusing to say, weighted with questions we had been afraid to ask. The windows had fogged completely now, creating the illusion that we were the only two people in the world, suspended in this moment outside of time and consequence. When Julian finally broke the silence, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me I'm not the only one feeling this," he said. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, like a confession, like a prayer. I knew that how I answered would change everything, would cross a line that neither of us could ever uncross. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear it echoing in my ears above the sound of the rain. Instead of answering with words, I found myself leaning toward him across the space that separated us. My hand reached for his face, trembling as my fingers traced the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at my touch, and when he opened them again, they were filled with something that looked like relief, like coming home, like recognition of a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface of our carefully constructed friendship. I kissed him then, tentative at first, barely a whisper of contact, as if I could take it back if it proved to be a mistake. But Julian responded immediately, his hand finding the back of my neck, drawing me closer, and the kiss deepened into something urgent and desperate and undeniable. 20 years of denial collapsed in that moment. 20 years of carefully maintained boundaries dissolved like sugar in rain. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, we stared at each other in wonder and terror. The world outside the car continued to exist. The rain still fell, the street lights still cast their wavering glow, the city still hummed with its evening rhythms. But inside the car, everything had changed. We had changed. I had changed. "What do we do now?" I whispered, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like someone else's voice asking someone else's questions. Julian reached across the space between us and took my hand, holding it like something precious and fragile. "We stop lying to ourselves," he said simply. In that moment, I understood that everything we had told ourselves about our friendship, about our cover stories, about our innocent dinners and drives, had been elaborate self-deception. We had never been just covering for each other's need for freedom or escape. We had been covering for this, for the love that had been growing between us like something planted in darkness, reaching toward light we had been afraid to acknowledge. The kiss had been a revelation in the truest sense, a drawing back of curtains to reveal what had always been there, waiting. All the careful explanations I had constructed for my behavior over the past months, the restlessness in my marriage, the excitement I felt anticipating Julian's messages, the way our conversations seemed to nourish something in me that had been starving, suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. We sat in the car for another hour, holding hands like teenagers, talking in whispers about what this meant, what we were going to do, how we could possibly navigate the wreckage we were about to create. The rain gradually softened to a gentle patter, and the windows began to clear, letting in glimpses of the world we would have to return to eventually. But for that hour, in the suspended time between our old lives and whatever came next, we existed in perfect honesty with each other and with ourselves. We had stopped lying, stopped pretending, stopped hiding from the truth that had been pursuing us for months. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. The days following that kiss in Julian's car felt like living underwater. Everything moved slowly, sounds seemed muffled, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. I went through the motions of my regular life: breakfast with the family, meetings at the office, homework supervision in the evenings. But I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines, improvising my way through scenes in a play I no longer understood. Clara noticed the change immediately, though she couldn't have known what had caused it. I caught her watching me across the dinner table with a puzzled expression, as if I were a familiar song played in a different key. When she asked if everything was all right, I heard myself giving vague answers about work stress and winter blues, deflections that felt increasingly hollow with each repetition. Julian and I texted constantly now, but our messages had taken on a different quality, more urgent, more desperate, coated with references to feelings we couldn't quite name in writing. We met twice more that week, both times in his car, both times ending with kisses that left me shaking and exhilarated and terrified of what we were unleashing. But the secrecy that had once felt exciting now felt corrosive. Every lie I told Clara, and I was lying constantly now, about where I had been, who I had talked to, why I was distracted, felt like acid eating away at something fundamental. I began to avoid eye contact with my children at breakfast, afraid they might see through me to the truth I was carrying like a guilty secret. At work, my colleagues began to comment on my distraction. Linda Martinez, who had worked in the office longer than anyone, asked if I was feeling well, said I looked like I had been losing sleep. She wasn't wrong. I lay awake most nights now, staring at the ceiling while Clara slept beside me, replaying conversations with Julian, imagining scenarios I couldn't pursue, wrestling with desires I had spent a lifetime suppressing. Julian was struggling too, though his crisis manifested differently. Where I withdrew into myself, he became restless, almost manic in his energy. He told me about pacing his house after Vanessa and Sophie went to bed, about starting projects he couldn't finish, about feeling like his skin was too small for his body. His teaching suffered. He admitted to snapping at students, to losing his patience during rehearsals, to forgetting parent conferences and grading deadlines. 3 weeks after our first kiss, Vanessa confronted him directly. She had found our text messages, she told him, had gone through his phone while he was in the shower, and discovered months of communication that made their true intimacy impossible to deny. She didn't understand all of what she had read, but she understood enough. He told me about Vanessa's tears, about Sophie asking why mommy was crying, about packing a bag and leaving because he couldn't bear to lie anymore, not even to buy himself time to think. The reckoning I had been dreading came for me a week later, on a Tuesday evening in January while I was helping David with a science project about solar systems. Clara appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, holding my phone, which I had left charging on the counter. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "David," she said quietly, "why don't you go start your bath? Daddy and I need to talk." I knew without asking that she had seen Julian's latest message, something about needing to see me, about not being able to sleep, about missing me in ways that left no room for innocent interpretation. I watched my 9-year-old son gather his materials and disappear upstairs, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to fracture in ways he couldn't possibly understand. Clara set the phone on the kitchen table between us and sat down across from me. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not anger exactly, but a kind of hollow recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment longer than either of us realized. "Are you having an affair?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. I opened my mouth to deny it, to offer another explanation, to buy myself more time with another carefully constructed lie. But the words wouldn't come. Something in Clara's face, the resignation beneath the hurt, the way she looked at me as if she already knew the answer, made deception feel impossible. My silence stretched too long, became an answer in itself. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she asked the question I had been dreading. Who is it? I told her about Julian, about our reconnection, about the months of meetings that had started as friendship and become something else entirely. I didn't give her details. I couldn't bear to describe our kisses, our confessions, the way he looked at me in the darkness of his car, but I told her enough. I told her that I was in love with him, that I had been lying to her and to myself, that I didn't know how to stop. Clara listened without interruption, her hands still folded, her tears falling silently onto the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped our children with homework, where we had planned family vacations and discussed mortgage refinancing and decided which elementary school would be best for Emma. The ordinariness of the setting made the conversation feel surreal, like discussing the end of the world while doing dishes. When I finished talking, Clara sat in silence for a long time. Outside, I could hear David splashing in the bathtub upstairs, Emma practicing violin in her room, the dishwasher cycling through its evening routine. Life continuing as if nothing fundamental had shifted, though everything had. Finally, Clara spoke. She said she had known something was wrong for months, that I had been disappearing even when I was sitting right beside her. She said she had hoped it was a phase, a midlife crisis that would pass, something we could work through together. But now, hearing me say I was in love with someone else, not just having an affair, but actually in love, she understood that this wasn't something we could fix with counseling or communication or time. The conversation that followed was the most honest one we had shared in years, and also the most painful. Clara asked if I wanted to try to save our marriage, if I was willing to end things with Julian and work on rebuilding what we had lost. I wanted to tell her yes, wanted to choose the path of least destruction, wanted to protect our children from the earthquake that was coming. But I couldn't lie to her anymore, couldn't promise to give up the only thing that had made me feel truly alive in decades. I told her I didn't know if I could go back to the way things were, didn't know if I could pretend to be someone I was no longer sure I had ever been. The hardest part wasn't admitting I loved Julian. It was admitting that I had never loved Clara the way she deserved to be loved, the way she had loved me. Our marriage had been built on compatibility and convenience and the shared goal of creating a stable family, but never on the kind of passion that made lying impossible, that made everything else feel like performance. Clara deserved better than that, I realized. She deserved someone who couldn't imagine being anywhere else, someone who didn't have to work to pay attention to her stories, someone who looked forward to coming home instead of finding excuses to leave. My affair with Julian wasn't just about discovering my attraction to men. It was about discovering what it felt like to love someone so completely that deception became unbearable. That night, after Clara had gone to bed and the children were asleep, I sat in my kitchen staring at two objects on the counter: my wedding ring, which I had removed during our conversation, and a note Clara had written asking me to think carefully about what I wanted, what I was willing to sacrifice, and what kind of father I wanted to be to Emma and David. The choice wasn't simple. I loved my children with a fierceness that surprised me every day, and the thought of disrupting their lives, of becoming a part-time parent, of explaining to them why their family was falling apart, felt like contemplating an act of violence. But I also knew that I couldn't return to the suffocating performance of the last 20 years, couldn't pretend that what I felt for Julian was something I could simply choose to stop feeling. For the first time in my adult life, I was being forced to choose between love and safety, between authenticity and stability, between the life I had built and the life I was finally brave enough to want. The decision came to me in the quiet hours before dawn, in the space between night and morning when the house held its breath, and I could hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in months. I had been sitting in the kitchen since 3 a.m., alternating between staring at my wedding ring and the note Clara had left me, weighing 20 years of marriage against the possibility of a life I had never allowed myself to imagine. Emma and David were asleep upstairs, their rooms filled with the detritus of childhood, soccer cleats and art projects, homework assignments and stuffed animals they were almost too old to admit they still needed. In a few hours, they would wake up expecting breakfast and clean clothes and their father to be the same man he had been yesterday. But I knew I couldn't give them that man anymore. He had been disappearing for months, dissolving like sugar in rain, leaving behind someone I was still learning to recognize. I thought about all the ways this could go wrong. The custody arrangements that would slice my time with my children into weekends and holidays. The explanations I would have to give to neighbors and colleagues who had known me as half of a couple for so long that my individual identity had nearly vanished. The financial complexity of dividing a life into separate pieces. The possibility that Julian and I, freed from the intensity of secrecy, might discover that what we felt was unsustainable in the harsh light of ordinary days. But I also thought about the man I had been becoming in Julian's presence, more honest, more alive, more willing to ask difficult questions and sit with uncomfortable answers. That man couldn't continue to exist in the margins of stolen evenings and elaborate deceptions. He needed space to breathe, room to grow, permission to love without apology. At 5:30, as the first gray light began to filter through the kitchen windows, I wrote a letter to Clara. Not an explanation. We had moved beyond the need for explanations, but an acknowledgement of what she deserved, what our children deserved, what I owed to the life we had built together even as I prepared to leave it behind. I told her that she had been a good wife and mother, that our failures as a couple were not her fault, that the love she had given me had been real and valuable even if I hadn't been capable of returning it in the same measure. I promised to be fair in our divorce proceedings, to prioritize the children's well-being above my own convenience, to answer their questions as honestly as their ages allowed. I told her that I was sorry for the deception, for the months of lies, for choosing to discover myself at the cost of her peace of mind. But I couldn't apologize for what I had discovered, couldn't promise to return to a version of myself that had never been entirely real. When I finished writing, I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter next to my wedding ring. The two objects sat there like artifacts from a life I was preparing to step away from, not with anger or resentment, but with the kind of sad gratitude you feel when saying goodbye to a house you've outgrown. I made coffee and watched the sun rise over our neighborhood, illuminating the identical lawns and driveways where my neighbors would soon emerge to collect their newspapers and begin their own carefully orchestrated days. For 14 years, I had been part of this rhythm, this suburban ballet of school drop-offs and lawn care and weekend barbecues. In a few hours, I would begin the process of extracting myself from it, of becoming something new and uncertain. At 7 o'clock, I heard movement upstairs, Clara's alarm, the sound of water running in the master bathroom, the beginning of our family's morning routine. I knew I should wake the children, help them get ready for school, maintain the illusion of normalcy for a few more hours. Instead, I walked quietly to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of winter's final push before spring. I stood there in my socks and pajamas, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson was already in her garden, checking for early bulbs beneath the snow. A school bus rumbled past, though it was too early for our children's pickup. The world was waking up, continuing its relentless forward motion, indifferent to the small revolution happening on my front porch. I had texted Julian an hour earlier, a simple message, "I'm ready." He had responded immediately, "I'll be there." Now I saw his car turning onto our street, moving slowly, carefully, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. He parked at the curb and sat there with the engine running, waiting. Through the windshield, I could see his profile, the set of his shoulders, the steady way he gripped the steering wheel. He looked tired but determined, like a man who had also spent the night making difficult decisions. I thought about my children sleeping upstairs, about the conversations we would have to have, the adjustments we would all have to make. I thought about Clara finding my letter, about the relief and hurt and anger she would feel in equal measure. I thought about the life Julian and I might build together, fragile, uncertain, criticized by some and celebrated by others, but undeniably true. The future stretched ahead of me like an unmapped road, full of possibilities I couldn't predict or control. I didn't know if Julian and I would last, if our love could survive the transition from secret to reality. I didn't know if my children would forgive me, if I would find a way to be the father they needed while also being the man I was finally becoming. I didn't know if I would ever stop feeling guilty about the wreckage I was leaving behind, but I knew I couldn't go back to lying, to pretending, to the suffocating performance of being someone I wasn't. I had tasted authenticity, and it had changed me at a cellular level. There was no returning to the man who had sat in his car that night, sliding his wedding ring on and off, rehearsing lies that felt like poison in his mouth. I took one last look at the house where I had spent 14 years learning to be a husband and father, where I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside while slowly dying inside. Then I walked down the front steps, across the lawn, toward the car where Julian waited with infinite patience and infinite hope. As I reached for the door handle, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, but a quiet recognition of truth finally acknowledged. I was 42 years old, and I was finally learning how to breathe.